Today I want to take a look at motivational interviewing. So this is a really commonly discussed tactic or clinical intervention, particularly in addiction counseling. But motivational interviewing is really initially designed more for doctors and nurses and those settings where you are really interviewing or taking that intake appointment on the client. And so when we're looking at motivational interviewing in counseling, it's important to note that we don't want our counseling to center around interviewing or what we often call interrogating the client. This does not foster an exceptional counselor-client relationship. So when you're looking on how to integrate motivational interviewing or how to use this technique with your clients, it's important to understand the purpose of it and what we're actually trying to accomplish. So the first thing that I want to look at in understanding why motivation is important and how we're going to use motivation in our counseling, you have to look at the stages of change. Now, the stages of change are really often associated with addiction, but I want to make sure everyone is aware that this cycle is the same regardless of whether you're talking about anxiety, depression, or any other negative symptoms. And so you're going to go through several stages. And as a clinician, you have to first start by identifying which stage your client is in. And then all of your interventions are going to focus in on helping the client get to the next stage of change. So let's first walk through what those stages of change are. So first is pre-contemplation. When you're looking at the pre-contemplation stage of change, you're looking at someone who doesn't realize they have a problem. And so this can be a client who's using opiates, who says that it doesn't cause a problem for them. And you often see this with amphetamines. They see it as it's helping them. It's not really causing any problems. And you can also see this with anxiety, depression, dependency, or any other mental health symptoms. When the client is in that denial period, that is what we call the pre-contemplative stage of change. Now, often, counselors don't see clients in this stage of change because they don't generally come to counseling at this point. If they don't think they have a problem, they're not going to come to counseling. There, of course, are some exceptions to this. Often other people in their lives have told them that it's a problem and urged them or even forced them or taken them to counseling. So, for example, with children, maybe the parents are taking them to counseling, but the child doesn't acknowledge there's a problem yet. Maybe it's court-ordered or mandated counseling. Often you'll get someone who says that, addiction isn't a problem, or they don't have an anger problem, or all those things that would end you up in legal issues. Now, when you're looking at that pre-contemplative and that's someone who doesn't identify as a problem, very, very often clinicians are a little quick to put them in this stage when they're not really in that stage. So, for example, when you have someone who's coming in for court-ordered counseling, you usually, at the very least, they acknowledge that this problem or this has caused legal problems in their life. And so one of the issues we have as a clinician is we want to immediately narrow in on what we see as the biggest problem. So, for example, you have a client who's been arrested for drunk driving, and they're court ordered to go to counseling, and they're saying, I don't have an alcohol problem. And so the clinician is often really just focused in on getting them to admit that they have an alcohol problem. But remember, when you're using person-centered techniques, which is what is required in nearly every state in the United States, you want to focus in on what does the client see as a problem. And so if you have a client who doesn't see their alcohol use as a problem, but does see that they have legal problems, then you would focus in on the legal problems, not the alcohol. Now, as any good clinician knows, the more that you narrow things down, you are going to get down to the juice of it. So there's no need to fret on that. No need to say, well, we have to get them to that point faster. We have to get them to see faster. That's not really going to be truly helpful to your client. So when you're looking at the pre-contemplative stage of change and you're seeing a client that doesn't seem to acknowledge they have any problems, take a step back as a clinician and ask yourself, are you trying to force them into acknowledging what you think is the problem? Are there other problems that they are acknowledging? So for example, a family member forced them to come in. Well, this is causing problems between you and your family member. So let's focus in on that. And so that's really important in that pre-contemplative stage to help the client identify what problems they want to work on, and just putting your own values and beliefs aside to stay with that client in that moment. Now, when we look at the next stage of change, is the contemplative stage of change. In the contemplative stage of change, your client acknowledges that they have a problem. So most often, this is where your client's going to come into treatment, particularly if you're talking about addictions treatment, medication-assisted treatment, where they're coming in addicted to opioids and they're saying, I'm addicted to opioids. They may not want to stop the opioid use, but at the very least, they will generally acknowledge that the opioid use causes a problem. So, for example, it causes withdrawal. That's a problem. It causes legal problems. That's a problem. It causes financial problems, and there's just multiple problems that come out of it. So most often, that client is going to be in that contemplative stage of change. It's going to be the same with your private practice or your other facilities. Most often, your client's coming to you and saying that they have a problem. Now, when they are in that contemplative stage of change, they don't have a plan in place to change that problem. So very often, we as clinicians see clients come in with the concept of, I want things in my life to change, but I don't actually want to change anything. And so that is your contemplative stage of change in a nutshell. They're not really to make a plan, not ready to make a plan to actually change anything. And so that's what you're working on in that contemplative stage of change. So as I mentioned in the beginning, all of your treatment interventions are going to focus in on helping your client move to the next stage of change. And so in that contemplative stage of change, you're helping them move towards making a plan for change. In that pre-contemplative stage of change, you're helping your client move towards understanding their underlying problem and acknowledging that they have a problem and realizing that they need to work on something or they want to work on something to change. So in that pre-contemplative stage of change, your treatment plan goals should be focused in on helping the client get to the contemplative stage of change, acknowledging and understanding their problem. In the contemplative stage of change, all of your treatment interventions should be focused on helping that client get to the preparation stage of change. So for example, if you are working with a client who has anxiety, and they come into treatment and you say, what's your goal? What's the treatment plan? They say, I don't want to have any anxiety. I want to have no anxiety. Well, if they are in the pre-contemplative stage of change or the contemplative stage of change, that is not a realistic goal, and that is not where you're going to want to set your treatment intervention. First, they have to get a plan for change, and then they have to start moving forward in that change. And so if they're in the contemplative stage of change and they want to set that first goal, having no anxiety is not going to be a goal that works. You're going to want to focus that in on setting up a plan or choosing what their plan is going to be or planning out what their next steps are in moving them towards a healthier state. Now, you're going to see this across all of my videos. Removing all anxiety is not only a completely unrealistic goal, but it would make you an absolute sociopath, or as they say sometimes in ACA, it's a dead goal. That would mean that you're dead if you don't have anxiety. And so that is not a good goal, but I'm using that as an example because it's something clients often say. It's similar with addiction. You have a client come in, they're actively using IV heroin, and you ask them what do they want to get out of treatment, and they'll give you something along the lines of, I want to be sober. To be honest, they'll probably say clean, but we'll change that language because we don't use dirty and clean. And so when you're looking at someone who's IV using heroin to have their goal to get sober, that is not going to be a realistic goal. If you want to really look in at those stages of change and say, okay, so if you're actively using heroin and you haven't made a plan for change and you haven't actually made change, let's focus in on where you are now as they contemplate a stage of change because you've already acknowledged there's a problem. How are we going to move you towards that preparation stage of change? So let's start working on your plan for change. And that's where you want to stay until they're really solid in that preparation stage and then ready to take some action forward. One of the biggest problems that we have in mental health treatment is counselors and clinicians who want to get ahead of themselves, who really come in with that idea of wanting to fix the problem, get the client there as fast as possible. And when you do that and you set the goals too big and you don't look at where they are and where their next step should be, you have the increased risk of fostering shame with your client. So you're putting your client in a position where they're likely to not reach their goal, and every time they don't reach the goal, that is increasing their shame. And shame is one of the greatest negative effects of or ongoing reasons that people use illicit substances or have other negative mental health symptoms. You think of cutting, picking, eating disorders. A lot of those negative behaviors are going to be really rooted in shame. And so when we're working with our clients on setting up treatment plans, it's absolutely essential that their goals are going in a reasonable place for them so they can move them through. So looking at the next stage of change, we have the preparation stage of change. It's exactly what it sounds like. You just want to make sure you're not moving through it too quickly. So things you'll do in this stage, maybe help identify triggers, what causes your depressed mood, when do you experience anxiety symptoms, when do you have those cravings, when do you have those negative desires. And so you're going to help the client identify what the problem is, what's going on. You're going to be using psychoeducation in both the contemplative and the preparation stage of change to help the client understand what's happening in their mind, how this is impacting them, and what's going to be a healthy direction for them to go in. You're going to look at understanding your client better, helping your client choose and figure out what types of coping skills or what types of things do they want to try. Do they want to try medication? Do they want to try exposure therapy? And so to do that, they have to have all of the information. And so don't rush through the preparation stage of change. This is not a one-day stage. Now, when you're doing faster or briefer therapy, it can go a little bit faster. But when you're doing long-term major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, any of your larger mental health personality disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, opioid addiction, or amphetamine addiction, those higher alcohol addiction, you're going to want to go through these stages slowly and carefully so that you know your client is consistently achieving their goals and reducing their shame before you move them on. Now, the action stage of change is kind of self-explanatory, but the one key thing to note here is any real steps towards change is going to really qualify them in the action stage of change. So, for example, one thing that I see often with counselors is that they'll have a client who came in for opioid treatment, stopped using opioids but is still using amphetamine, and people will list them as being in the contemplative or the preparation stage of change. If they have stopped using those opioids, even though they're still using amphetamines, they are in the action stage of change. And so when they're out there actively taking action, that's when you want to put them in that phase. By definition, it's going to be the longest phase. It's where your clients are going to spend the most time, and your goal in the action stage of change, of course, is going to be preparing them to get into that maintenance stage. And that's going to take some time and some building up of goals to get there. Again, you want to make sure that you're having success, that your client is repeatedly over and over completing those goals, and so that they're going to keep moving forward. The maintenance stage of change is generally going to be identified as about 1 year of no symptoms. So if you're talking about anxiety, it would be 1 year of controlled anxiety or managed anxiety. Addiction, it would be 1 year of negative drug screens or non-illicit drug screens, 1 year of stability. And so when we're looking at that maintenance stage of change, we're looking at holding them in that stage and taking them to a point where we're removing or reducing the problem as much as possible. Now, the final one you're going to see in the middle of this model, I have called the return to use or return to symptoms stage of change. This in itself is not really a stage. It's a stepping point that takes you from one to the other. And so, for example, if you're in the maintenance stage of change, you have 1 year of absent symptoms, and then you go out and you use heroin once. The next day you come back in and go to stop. That means that you just stepped one step back into the action stage of change, it does not revert you back to the beginning, all the way back to contemplative.